Ever feel like you're just drowning in news? You know, that feeling?
Absolutely, information overload.
Exactly. It's that constant pressure, wanting to be informed, but without getting totally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Well, that's really why we put together this deep dive for you. We've sifted through, well, a whole stack of sources about what happened globally and in the U.S. on one specific day, June 26th, 2025.
The busy one.
Oh, yeah. Our mission today is simple: cut through all that noise, connect some dots, and basically hand you the most important nuggets of knowledge from that day.
Right. And the goal isn't just for you to know what made headlines, because you probably saw some of those. It's more about understanding why. Why did these things matter? What are the broader implications?
Okay, let's dive in and unpack this incredible stack of information. Because you'll see, June 26, 2025, it wasn't just another Tuesday or whatever it was like a real convergence point. We're talking high-stakes stuff in the Middle East, huge economic shifts, big policy fights here in the U.S., even some major cultural moments. It felt like everything's happening at once.
It really did.
So let's kick things off with those geopolitical fault lines. The Middle East specifically. The absolute heart of it was this 12-day military clash between Iran and Israel.
And the roots there, they run deep. Escalating tensions over Iran's nuclear program, its regional influence, plus, those long-running proxy conflicts, it all came to a head.
So what actually happened leading up to the 26th?
Well, that's critical. Before June 26, both the U.S. and Israel had already carried out strikes. Multiple Iranian nuclear sites, military installations, they were hit.
Okay.
Then on the 26th, the U.S. publicly declared Operation Midnight Hammer a major success. They specifically cited destroying key places like the Fordo facility using bunker buster munitions.
Who announced this?
It was formally announced by the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and General Dan Kane. So a very official declaration of success.
But Iran, they didn't exactly agree with that assessment, did they?
Not at all. Iran pushed back hard with a really bold counter-narrative. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, he publicly said Iran delivered a heavy slap to the U.S., claimed strategic success.
A heavy slap. So completely different stories. How do you even square that?
Well, you don't, really.
Yeah.
And that's where the skepticism immediately popped up. Critics, and they were pointing to European intelligence, argued Iran probably still had a lot of its uranium stock.
So the strikes might not have actually set them back that much.
Exactly. The thinking was maybe it was more symbolic damage than, actual material impact on their program. And we even saw a debate inside the U.S. government.
Oh, really? Like what?
Pentagon leaks questioning how successful it really was.
Yeah.
But then you had officials like CIA Director John Ratcliffe and DNI Tulsi Gabbard defending the operation, saying it was effective.
Interesting. And didn't the White House do something with the intelligence?
Yeah, they restricted congressional access to some of the classified intel related to it, which, only added fuel to the fire for those questioning the official story.
Now, there was also this comparison President Trump made. Pretty controversial, right?
Extremely. He linked this military action to the historic bombing of Japan in World War II.
Wow. How did that go over internationally?
About as well as you'd expect. Immediate, sharp backlash, especially from Japanese officials. It just highlights how sensitive those kinds of historical comparisons really are on the world stage.
Okay, so lots of conflicting stories, but was there any move towards de-escalation?
There was actually, a
Yeah.
fragile one, but yes. A ceasefire brokered by Qatar had technically started a couple of days earlier on June 24th.
Qatar. Interesting.
Yeah, and that was attributed largely to President Trump's high-level diplomacy, but also significantly to Qatar's mediation efforts.
So a middle power playing a key role.
Precisely. And that's maybe a hint of how peacemaking might be changing, Not just the big superpowers anymore. Qatar stepping up is a crucial go-between. It suggests a more complex, multipolar approach may be emerging.
But you said fragile. Did it hold immediately?
Not perfectly. Israel intercepted some missiles just 3 hours after the truce began. That triggered a limited retaliatory strike from their side. But overall, the de-escalation did seem to persist, despite that wobble.
Okay. And what about the diplomatic fallout? Any immediate consequences?
Oh, yes. Swiftly. On June 26th, Australia announced it was suspending most of its embassy functions in Tehran, relocating staff to Azerbaijan, citing security threats.
And they weren't the only ones.
No. Pakistan also sealed its border with Iran. That suggests real concern spreading among the neighboring countries.
So if we zoom out, what's the big picture takeaway from all this Middle East tension on that day?
Well, I think it really throws into sharp relief just how fragile any kind of lasting peace is in the region. It highlights these deep, deep splits on war strategy, even within alliances. And it definitely raises questions about public trust when it comes to national security communications. Whose narrative do you believe? It's a stark reminder of how fast things can shift globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And these global shifts, they aren't just political, are they? They hit the economy, they hit industries hard.
Definitely.
So let's pivot now. Let's talk about those economic currents and also the tech dominance that was really shaping things. We have the ongoing US-China trade spat. China had recently put export curbs on rare earth elements.
Right, and those are crucial for electronics, EVs, so much modern tech.
So what was the US response looking like on June 26th?
Well, policymakers were seriously looking at boosting domestic rare earth processing, trying to become less reliant on China. And there was also serious talk maybe imposing 25% tariffs on copper imports.
Another move towards domestic production.
Exactly. A clear push to bring production of these vital materials closer to home.
And did the markets notice this talk?
Immediately. Stocks for MP Materials, that's the main U.S. rare earth company, they jumped sharply that day. And Freeport-McMoRan, a big copper player, surged too, just on the talk of potential tariffs.
So what's the bigger policy debate here? Strengthening supply chains versus what? Higher costs.
That's the core tension. Bolstering U.S. supply chains, reducing dependence on China, generally seen as good for national security, economic independence. But the flip side is, it could hike costs for manufacturers.
Which means higher prices for consumers, potentially.
Potentially, yes. So the tariff discussions were, and remain, really polarized. You have protectionists supporting them, but economists warning about retaliation from other countries, potential trade wars. It's a real balancing act.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly within the economy. Tech world. NVIDIA, they were on an absolute tear, weren't they?
Yeah. It's just incredible. Hitting a record valuation that day. And this wasn't just, a good quarter. It was driven by this almost insatiable demand for AI chips, plus the massive build-out of data centers needed for AI.
What were the numbers like?
Their stock hit over $150 a share. Market cap ballooned to over $3.7 trillion, actually surpassing Microsoft for a time.
Wow. So this isn't just one company doing well. It feels like AI is just pulling the whole market along.
It really felt like that. But it's important to remember the context with NVIDIA. They'd had some turbulence earlier, right? A big multi-billion-dollar charge related to export controls on their H20 chips going to China.
Ah, right. So it wasn't all smooth sailing.
No. But analysts were pointing to NVIDIA's CEDA ecosystem. That's their powerful software platform that's really crucial for AI development, and just their central role in the whole AI revolution as the key reasons for this incredible growth.
But was everyone buying into the hype? Any concerns?
There were definitely concerns about the valuation. Trading at around 50 times trailing earnings, that's pretty steep, even for a hot tech stock. So some caution signs were there.
Okay, zooming out again to the broader markets on the 26th. What was the global picture? You mentioned NVIDIA soaring, but was everything up?
It was actually a mixed bag globally. Take the U.S. dollar. It had dropped about 10% in the first half of the year. Its worst first half performance since 1973.
Wow, why such a big drop for the dollar?
Mostly signals from the Fed about potential rate cuts coming. Plus, ongoing political instability. President Trump's public criticisms of Fed Chair Powell didn't help confidence either.
But U.S. stocks were rallying. You said NVIDIA, Microsoft.
Exactly. Despite the weak dollar, U.S. equity markets were hitting all-time highs. The NASDAQ 100, S&P 500, MSCI indices, all records.
So what fueled that rally then, if the dollar was weak?
A few things. Those big tech names like NVIDIA and Microsoft, definitely. Also, maybe some relief from the Middle East tensions cooling slightly with the ceasefire. Anticipation of the Fed maybe easing rates soon. And some real industrial strength from companies like Micron, the chip maker.
So if you had to boil it down, what does this complex economic picture mean for, for you listening?
Well, it's this picture of strong growth in pockets, especially tech, but underneath, skyrocketing macroeconomic uncertainty, currency risks hitting exporters, and this political interference or perceived interference with the Fed's independence. That really had economists worried.
So the takeaway is what? Even when things look good on the surface, like the stock market, there are these underlying tensions.
Pretty much. It shows how political decisions, trade disputes, even just presidential comments about the Fed can directly impact market stability, currency values, and potentially, how much you pay for things. That link between geopolitics and your wallet feels very direct right now.
Okay, so those economic waves inevitably ripple into domestic policy, right? Funding battles, rights debates.
Always.
So let's bring it back home now to the U.S. domestic policy scene, because June 26th saw some major battles playing out, starting with the Supreme Court. A huge ruling came down that day.
Yeah, a landmark one. The court ruled that states could deny Medicaid funding to Planned Parenthood. And crucially, even if those specific funds weren't being used for abortion services.
Right. So denying funding for things like cancer screenings, contraception.
Exactly. And the reaction was, as you'd imagine, immediate and starkly divided. Conservative groups, many Republican lawmakers, they hailed it as a victory for states' rights.
And the other side.
Planned Parenthood, their supporters, advocacy groups, they warned this would seriously jeopardize access to essential health care for millions, especially low-income Americans, particularly women. They feared clinic closures, reduced access to those vital non-abortion services, especially hitting rural areas hard.
And this wasn't happening in a vacuum, right? It tied into a bigger budget fight.
Directly. President Trump had this massive legislative push called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. You might remember hearing about it. It bundled tax cuts, increased border controls, but also proposed nearly $800 billion in cuts to Medicaid.
$800 billion. That's huge. How is that going?
It hit a major snag on June 26th. The Senate parliamentarian, that's the nonpartisan rule keeper, determined that those critical Medicaid cuts violated procedural rules for the type of bill they were trying to pass.
So that put the whole bill in danger.
Serious danger, yeah. Especially with the July 4th deadline looming. And it wasn't just procedural. Several key Republican senators, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Josh Hawley, were still blocking it.
Why were they blocking it?
Concerns about the impact on rural hospitals and vulnerable populations in their states. Senator Collins even rejected a last-minute offer of a $15 billion relief fund for rural hospitals. Said it just wasn't enough to offset the proposed cuts.
Okay, switching gears to immigration policy. There were reports coming out that day too, right, about asylum seekers?
Yes. Reports emerged. The administration was prepping a plan to deny refugee status to potentially hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers. The key group seemed to be those who entered the country outside official ports of entry.
And the consequence of denial.
They'd be made immediately deportable.
How was that news received?
Predictably, immigrant rights groups, Democrats, they condemned it strongly, called it cruel, inhumane. Protests started popping up. And adding to the tension, news also broke on the 26th that a Canadian citizen had actually died while in ICE custody. That's Immigration and Customs Enforcement awaiting removal from the U.S.
Oh, wow. That must have fueled the debate even more.
It absolutely did. Fueled the debate over the conditions and practices within the U.S. immigration detention system, and it also strained diplomatic relations with Canada.
Okay, now here's a really curious bureaucratic story from that day. The Trump administration announced it was moving an entire federal department, HUD Housing and Urban Development, out of Washington, D.C.
Right. Moving it into the headquarters of the National Science Foundation, the NSF, over in Alexandria, Virginia.
Okay, that sounds disruptive. What was the impact? Why do that?
Well, first, the impact. It meant about 1,800 NSF employees, the science folks, were being forced to relocate to make room for the housing folks.
Just like that.
Pretty much. The union, representing federal employees, the AFGE, slammed the decision, cited a total lack of communication, lack of planning. They questioned the whole rationale behind it, pointing out the potential disruption.
So what was the rationale? Was one offered?
Not explicitly laid out in a way that satisfied critics, but you could read it as, well, maybe a symbolic move. Part of a push towards a leaner, perhaps more integrated federal government, maybe trying to break up the traditional D.C. power centers.
Interesting. Efficiency versus disruption, I guess.
That seems to be the debate, yeah. Raises big questions about how government should function and where.
We also saw a legal development involving a member of Congress.
Yes. LaMonica McIver, a Democratic congresswoman from New Jersey. She pleaded not guilty on June 26th to charges of assaulting an immigration officer.
Where did this allegedly happen?
During a visit she made to an ICE detention facility, a jail in Newark. And an interesting detail, the case against her was brought by Alina Habba,
Who is?
a former attorney for President Trump.
Got it. And one last quick hit on domestic policy. Something about vaccines.
Right. Former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy joined a vaccine advisory panel, but this panel had recently been overhauled by Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Who is known for being a prominent vaccine skeptic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Murthy joining that specific panel immediately raised red flags for many public health experts. They voiced concerns about, anti-vaccine rhetoric potentially gaining more prominence or legitimacy.
Wow. Okay. So June 26 really paints a picture of a nation grappling with some fundamental issues: healthcare access, budget priorities, immigration, even the structure of government itself.
Deep fissures, absolutely, both domestically and, as we saw earlier, globally.
And those domestic fights often connect back to the wider world stage. So let's broaden our view again. Let's talk about global cooperation, but also environmental stress. The Euro-Atlantic Summit was meeting in Brussels on the 26th.
Right, amidst all this other turmoil. They had a packed agenda. Ukraine's bid to join the EU, a new package of sanctions against Russia, tricky migration policies, even exploring a potential trade deal between the U.S. and the EU.
Sounds like a lot to agree on. Were there divisions?
Oh, definitely. You had key figures like EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen there, but Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, was pushing hard to suspend trade with Israel over the recent conflict.
And was that popular?
Not universally. Hungary and Slovakia were pushing back on the new Russia sanctions, demanding concessions first. And on migration, you had this tension between, say, Germany's stricter position and Hungary's really hardline stance. It really showcased the internal pulling and pushing within the EU.
And just before that, NATO had met in The Hague.
Correct. June 24th and 25th. The big focus there was collective defense. Specifically, this very aggressive goal they set, members spending 5% of their GDP on defense.
5%. That's a huge jump from the old 2% target. What was driving that?
Serious concerns about Russia's military posture, its actions, and frankly, fading trust in the reliability of U.S. security commitments under the Trump administration.
How did they break down that 5%?
It was 3.5% for direct military spending and another 1.5% for supporting defense industries. The Secretary General, Mark Rutte, really emphasized this need for a wartime mindset.
And how did the U.S. react to that?
President Trump actually praised NATO members for increasing their defense commitments. Meanwhile, Turkey's President Erdogan used the summit to push again for a ceasefire in Gaza. So multiple agendas at play.
Okay, shifting from security to the environment, there was extreme weather hitting Europe.
Yes, an intense heat wave across the UK and parts of Europe. Record-breaking temperatures in southern England, France, Spain. Bologna and Italy saw extreme heat too.
And this wasn't just uncomfortable, right? You mentioned deaths.
Tragically, yes. The UK estimated around 570 heat-related deaths just in a 4-day period, June 19th to 22nd.
That's shocking. What were the other impacts?
Widespread public health alerts, major disruptions to transport, especially the London Underground. They even had evacuation protocols triggered at the Royal Ascot horse racing event because of the heat. Healthcare systems were strained.
And this reignited the climate change debate.
Absolutely. It brought concerns about rising climate risks linked to global warming right back to the forefront. There was quite a bit of criticism aimed at the UK government for what some saw as a fairly mild response.
What did critics say?
Environmental groups called it a practice run for future climate resilience failures. A really stark reminder that the impacts of climate change aren't some distant future threat. They're happening now, affecting lives, infrastructure, everything.
On a different global note, June 26 was also an International Awareness Day.
It was the International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking. The theme for 2025 was Break the Cycle. Right. Hashtag Stop Organized Crime.
What was the focus there?
Really trying to disrupt the networks behind drug crime. Excerpts were highlighting the alarming rise in overdose deaths, especially linked to synthetic opioids, and the transnational criminal organizations, the cartels, driving the trafficking.
Did it spark policy discussion?
Yes. Renewed calls for policy reform, moving away from purely punitive, war on drugs type approaches towards more healthcare-based models, treating addiction as a public health issue. It reflected a broader global debate on how best to tackle the drug crisis.
And you mentioned protests elsewhere.
Right. Also on the 26th, major anti-government protests broke out in Kenya, sparked by a range of grievances, but particularly the rising cost of living. It just shows how quickly economic pressure can spill over into significant social unrest.
Okay, let's make one final pivot to the cultural landscape, because June 26th had some pretty big shifts there too, starting with the world of fashion.
Huge news. Anna Wintour announced she was stepping down as editor-in-chief of American Vogue after 37 years at the helm.
37 years? Is she retiring?
Not exactly. Shifting into broader global roles at the parent company, Condé Nast, focusing on editorial strategy across their other big brands like Vanity Fair, GQ.
What's her legacy seen as?
Immense. She fundamentally reshaped fashion media from when she started back in 1988. She turned the Met Gala from an industry event into this massive global spectacle, pioneered using celebrities on Vogue covers instead of just models.
Big shoes to fill for her successor.
Absolutely. The challenges for the next editor are huge. navigating the digital transition, obviously, but also grappling with these really important industry-wide issues: diversity, sustainability, inclusivity. The
Mhm.
fashion world is changing rapidly.
Now, moving to a very different kind of story, a high-profile legal case out of Idaho.
Yes, the case of Brian Koberger. He's the man accused in the tragic killings of 4 University of Idaho students back in November 2022. On June 26th, the judge refused a defense request to delay the trial.
And the judge also ruled on something else.
Rejected defense theories about alternate perpetrators, essentially shutting down that line of argument for now.
What does that mean for the case?
It means the case keeps moving forward towards trial, sticking to the prosecution's timeline. It's a case that's drawn intense national attention, and it's likely to keep influencing discussions about things like forensic evidence, DNA, and criminal procedures in these big, highly publicized trials.
Okay, let's talk media business now. Disney and Charter Communications, they reached some kind of deal.
A landmark agreement, actually. On June 26th, it involved bringing ad-supported versions of Disney Plus and also the upcoming standalone ESPN streaming service directly into Charter's Spectrum Select cable TV package.
So streaming services bundled with traditional cable sounds like blurring the lines.
Exactly. It's significant because it also restored several Disney-owned channels to Spectrum's lineup after a previous quite bitter dispute over carriage fees. So it bridges that gap between old-school cable and new-school streaming. Offers consumers maybe more convenience, fewer separate bills.
What's the strategy for Disney here?
Analysts see it as a smart, strategic move to combat cord cutting. People ditching cable. By putting their streaming options inside the cable bundle, they reach those viewers who haven't cut the cord yet, maybe tempt them over.
Interesting. A sort of truce in the streaming wars, maybe.
Could be seen that way.
Yeah.
Or at least a recognition that the future might be more hybrid than purely one or the other.
And sadly, June 26th also marked the passing of some really notable figures in media and entertainment.
Yes, quite a few losses that day. Bill Moyers, the PBS icon, passed away at 91.
A giant of public broadcasting.
Truly. Also, Lalo Schifrin, the Argentine composer, he was 93. Best known, of course, for writing the incredible theme music for Mission Impossible.
Instantly recognizable. Anyone else?
And Rick Hurst, the actor, passed at 79. Probably best remembered as Deputy Cletus Hogg on The Dukes of Hazzard.
Wow. It does feel like losing a connection to a certain era of broadcasting and entertainment, doesn't it?
It really does. Their legacies are huge. Moyers fundamentally changed public affairs TV. Schifrin wrote soundtracks that are just embedded in our culture. Hearst was part of a show that became a pop culture phenomenon. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, of how influential those mid-century talents were and how they shaped the media we still consume today.
Absolutely. And just one last bit of cultural news, more looking forward this time. Hollywood buzz.
Yeah, a big announcement. Denis Villeneuve, the acclaimed Canadian director, think Dune, arrival, he was officially announced as the director for the next James Bond film.
Villeneuve doing Bond. That sounds different.
It's seen as a really bold choice. Definitely signals a potential shift in the tone, maybe the style, of the Bond franchise. People are expecting something visually stunning, probably more narratively complex, maybe moving away from some of the more traditional Bond tropes. Big expectations there.
So when you pull it all together,
Wow.
wow, you can really see how interconnected everything was on that single day, June 26, 2025. It truly reflects a world in flux, doesn't it? Where geopolitics, markets, policy, culture, it all just converges.
Absolutely. And our goal with this deep dive today was really to try and cut through that surface noise.
Yeah.
To give you not just the headlines, but the key insights, the connections between these stories that you might miss if you're just quickly scanning the news.
Yeah.
It's about being informed, sure, but also trying to grasp the why behind the what, so you can think more critically about it all.
Right. So thinking about everything we've unpacked, the fragility we saw in international relations, the ceasefires, the huge economic shifts driven by tech and trade, the battles over rights and funding here at home, even the changes in how we get our news and entertainment. Here's something to chew on. What do you think is the single most underrated force shaping the headlines of tomorrow? What's the current we're not paying enough attention to?
That's a great question to ponder.
It is. Something for you to think about. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep making those surprising connections.